Liam Foster walked into the grand lobby of one of the world's leading technology corporations wearing a worn suit that had cost him less than $20. Within minutes, the young and celebrated chief executive officer, Amelia Hale, laughed in his face in front of dozens of managers and ordered security to remove the ragged stranger from the executive floor. Nobody in that gleaming lobby knew that the quiet man standing before them had built the very foundation the company now stood on, a foundation worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Then the private elevator doors slid open. Chairman Edward Sterling stepped out, crossed the marble floor, and reached for the stranger's hand with both of his own. 2 words left his mouth, and the entire lobby fell into silence. "Welcome back, boss." The morning had begun quietly, the way most important mornings do, without any warning of what was coming. Liam stood in front of a cracked mirror in a small apartment on the edge of the city, smoothing the wrinkles from a jacket he had owned for more years than he cared to count. The fabric had thinned at the elbows, and the stitching along one cuff had been repaired so many times that the thread no longer matched, but the suit was clean, pressed, and worn with the kind of quiet dignity that no price tag could buy. He checked his reflection once, adjusted his collar, and allowed himself a small, tired smile. He was not a man who cared for appearances, and yet today, of all days, he understood that appearances would matter more than they should. His watch was ordinary, the kind sold in any department store, its leather band cracked from years of use. His shoes were old as well, but he had polished them the night before until they shone under the kitchen light. A habit passed down from his father, who used to say that a man's shoes told the truth about him even when his words did not. Liam had no limousine waiting outside his building, no driver holding a door open with practiced grace. Instead, he walked 3 blocks in the cold morning air and hailed a yellow taxi, climbing into the back seat with the same unhurried calm that seemed to follow him everywhere. As the car rolled through the city, weaving between glass towers that reached toward a gray sky, he thought about how strange it was to be returning to a place he had once called home, a place that no longer remembered his face. Clothes do not make the man, he told himself silently, watching the buildings blur past the window. It was a simple thought, one he had carried with him for 2 decades, through every hardship, every quiet victory, every year spent away from the world that had once celebrated him. He did not know, as the taxi pulled up outside the towering glass headquarters, that within the hour those words would be tested in a way he had not expected, in front of an audience that had no idea who he truly was. The taxi driver, a friendly older man with graying hair, had asked him along the way whether he was headed to an important meeting, noting the address with a note of curiosity in his voice. Liam had simply nodded, offering nothing more, the way he always did when strangers asked about his life. He was not a man who enjoyed explaining himself, not because he had anything to hide, but because he had learned long ago that most people formed their opinions before they ever asked a single honest question. It was easier, he had found, to let silence answer for him, to let time reveal whatever needed revealing rather than force it into the open before it was ready. As the taxi idled at a red light 2 blocks from the headquarters, Liam glanced up at the glass tower rising above the surrounding buildings, its reflective surface catching the pale morning sun. Somewhere behind those windows, on floors he had once walked as though he owned every inch of them, an entirely new generation of employees now worked, unaware that the language running through their servers, the very bones of the systems keeping the company alive, had been shaped by his hands 2 decades earlier. He felt no bitterness looking up at it, only a quiet, distant nostalgia, the kind reserved for a home one has not visited in a very long time. Anyone watching him step out of that taxi might have wondered why a man so calm, so unhurried, so entirely at peace with himself, was walking toward a building where power and image ruled every hallway. But Liam Foster had never been a man who explained himself before he had to. And today would be no different. He straightened his jacket one final time, drew in a slow breath, and walked through the revolving doors into the vast marble lobby of the company he had helped create. The receptionist behind the polished front desk noticed him the moment he crossed the threshold, and her eyes moved over him with the swift, practiced judgment of someone trained to sort visitors into categories before they had spoken a single word. She took in the faded jacket, the modest shoes, the absence of anything that signaled wealth or importance, and her expression shifted into something just short of dismissive. When Liam approached the desk and said he had a meeting scheduled with the chairman, she asked him to repeat himself. Her tone edged with disbelief. She asked whether he was here to make a delivery, whether he was perhaps looking for a job posting on the lower floors, whether he understood that this particular lobby was reserved for scheduled visitors with proper documentation. Liam answered each question patiently, without irritation, and finally reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded letter bearing the chairman's own signature. The receptionist studied the letter, as though it might be a forgery, turning it over once, twice, searching for some flaw that would confirm her first impression of him. She could not find one, and that only seemed to unsettle her further. She excused herself and made a quiet phone call to a supervisor, cupping the receiver with her hand as though the stranger might not notice. Murmuring something about an unusual visitor with an unusual letter, Liam stood patiently through all of it, his hands folded in front of him, his expression unreadable, betraying none of the quiet amusement he might once have felt at being questioned so thoroughly inside a building he had helped design down to the wiring in its walls. Word travels quickly in a building full of idle eyes, and within minutes, several passing managers had slowed their steps to take in the unusual sight of a man in a threadbare suit standing at the center of the executive lobby. Two junior directors exchanged a glance and a low laugh as they walked by, one of them murmuring that his own shoes had probably cost more than the stranger's entire outfit. Another employee, a woman clutching a tablet against her chest, tilted her head and asked her colleague in a hushed voice whether the man had wandered in by mistake, perhaps confusing the building for something else entirely. A third onlooker, a young analyst barely a year into his career, pulled out his phone and snapped a quick photograph, already imagining how he might describe the strange scene to his coworkers over lunch. Nobody bothered to ask his name. Nobody imagined that the tired, unassuming figure standing quietly near the reception desk held more history within these walls than anyone currently employed by the company. Somewhere above them, on a floor few employees were ever permitted to visit, a framed photograph from the company's earliest days still hung in a private hallway, showing two young men standing in front of a modest storefront office, though neither of the two men in that faded photograph resembled anyone who worked in the building today. And certainly nobody remembered to compare its faces to the stranger currently drawing so much quiet ridicule below. The air in the lobby began to shift, thickening with the kind of tension that builds when a crowd senses a small drama is about to unfold, though none of them yet understood the true weight of what they were witnessing. Somewhere near the elevator banks, a security guard shifted his weight uncomfortably, sensing that something about the situation did not sit quite right. Though he could not have explained why. He had seen difficult visitors before, entitled ones, angry ones, confused ones, but this man carried none of those familiar traits. He simply waited, calm as still water, while the world around him buzzed with judgment he did not seem interested in correcting. It was into this simmering atmosphere that Amelia Hale descended, stepping out of the private elevator reserved for senior executives with the practiced elegance of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of command. She was sharp in every sense of the word, from the precise cut of her tailored blazer to the calculated authority in her stride, and she had built her reputation on an unwavering belief that image and competence were inseparable. She controlled every meeting she entered, anticipated every question before it was asked, and rarely allowed a single detail to escape her notice. Amelia had not risen to her position by accident. She had spent nearly 15 years climbing through an industry that rewarded confidence as much as intelligence, and along the way she had absorbed a hard, unspoken lesson that appearance often opened doors that talent alone could not. She dressed with precision every single day, not out of vanity, but because she had watched, time and again, how quickly a room could dismiss someone who did not look the part. It had become, over the years, less a personal preference and more a kind of armor, a belief system she rarely questioned because it had served her so reliably for so long. She had earned her title through relentless work, through late nights and difficult decisions, and she carried her authority the way a soldier carries a well-worn weapon, familiar and instinctive. That morning, as she crossed the lobby toward a scheduled briefing with the board's investment committee, her gaze caught on the unfamiliar figure standing near the front desk, and she paused mid-stride, her expression flickering with open curiosity that quickly hardened into suspicion. In all her years running this company, she had never once seen a man dressed so plainly standing in a space reserved for people who mattered, and something about the sight offended the very foundation of what she believed a leader's presence ought to convey to the world around them. She approached him directly, the click of her heels echoing off the marble floor, and studied him the way she might study a flawed proposal, searching for the fault line that would justify her instant judgment. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice carrying easily across the open space. Liam met her eyes without hesitation, his tone even and unbothered. "I have a meeting," he said simply. Amelia let out a short laugh, the sound sharp and disbelieving, certain that the man was either lost or lying, perhaps hoping to slip into the building under some false pretense. She asked to see his invitation, and when he handed it over without protest, she scanned the paper quickly, her eyes catching on the name printed near the bottom. For a moment, something flickered across her face, a flash of confusion she did not allow to linger. She decided, almost instantly, that this had to be some clerical mistake, an invitation sent to the wrong address, a name confused with someone else entirely. Surely a man dressed like this could not possibly be who the letter suggested he was, and she folded the paper closed with a dismissive motion, already convinced of her own conclusion. What happened next unfolded in front of dozens of witnesses, and it would be remembered by every person in that lobby for a long time afterward. Amelia's voice rose, no longer bothering to keep the exchange private, and her words carried across the marble floor with the kind of cutting precision she used in boardrooms to dismantle a weak argument. She told him that a $20 suit had no place among the executives who ran this company. She told him that the leadership floor was not designed for people who looked like him. She reminded him, loudly enough for every nearby employee to hear, that a company of this stature needed to protect its professional image, and that his mere presence in this lobby was already an embarrassment to everyone around him. Heads turned throughout the atrium. A few employees lifted their phones, uncertain whether to record the moment or simply stare in stunned silence. Whispers rippled outward in every direction, each one carrying its own version of speculation about who this stranger might be and why he had dared to walk into a place where he so clearly did not belong. According to the woman now standing over him, with her arms crossed and her judgment already delivered, a few of the onlookers began recording quietly with their phones held low, unwilling to draw attention to themselves but unable to resist capturing what felt like a moment worth remembering. Amelia did not seem to notice or care. She had built her career on decisive action, on never allowing uncertainty to linger in a room she controlled. And in her mind, this stranger's presence had already become a problem requiring an immediate solution, regardless of who he claimed to be or what letter he carried. Amelia turned toward the security desk and raised her hand, summoning 2 guards with a single sharp gesture. The lobby seemed to hold its breath as the guards approached, their footsteps slow and deliberate, everyone assuming they were about to witness the quiet, tired stranger being escorted out through the revolving doors in humiliation. And yet Liam did not raise his voice. He did not argue, did not reach for his phone to defend himself, did not offer a single word of protest against the accusations being hurled his way in front of a crowd of strangers. Inside, he felt none of the anger the situation might have justified, only a quiet, familiar recognition of something he had seen many times before, in many different rooms, across many years of a life spent watching people mistake confidence for competence and polish for worth. He had been underestimated before, in far more difficult circumstances than this, and he had learned long ago that the loudest response to an insult was rarely the wisest one. Patience, he had come to believe, was its own quiet form of strength, one that revealed far more about a person's character than any argument ever could. He simply looked at Amelia, his expression calm, almost gentle, and said 4 quiet words that seemed to hang in the air far longer than they should have. "I will wait," he said. Nothing more. The stillness in his voice, The total absence of anger or wounded pride struck several onlookers as strange, even unsettling, and a few of them began to wonder, for the first time, whether they were witnessing something entirely different from what they had assumed only moments before. The private elevator chimed again before the guards could reach him, and every head in the lobby turned toward the sound. The doors slid open to reveal Chairman Edward Sterling, a man whose presence alone was known to command instant silence throughout the building. He was older now, his hair fully gray, his shoulders slightly more stooped than they had been in the photographs still hanging in the private hallway upstairs, but his eyes carried the same sharp attentiveness they always had, missing nothing as he stepped out onto the marble floor. Employees who had been laughing only minutes earlier straightened immediately, some rising from where they had been leaning against the reception counter, others lowering their phones as though caught doing something forbidden. A hush spread outward from the elevator bank like ripples across still water, every conversation dying mid-sentence as people registered who had just arrived. Edward did not glance toward Amelia first, did not acknowledge the tense scene unfolding near the security desk, did not pause to ask what conflict had gathered such a crowd. His eyes moved directly to Liam, scanning the lobby with practiced speed, until they found the one face he had been waiting 3 weeks to see again. And something in his expression softened instantly, transforming from the composed authority of a chairman into something closer to old, weathered affection. He crossed the lobby in a few long strides, extending both hands toward the man in the worn jacket, and clasped Liam's hand between them, with a warmth that startled everyone watching. A smile spread across his face, the kind reserved for reunions long overdue, and he spoke 2 words that would echo through the company's hallways for weeks afterward. "Welcome back, boss." The entire lobby seemed to freeze in that instant, the air thick with stunned silence. Amelia stood motionless, her earlier confidence draining from her face as the weight of those 2 words settled over her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Whatever any of them had expected to happen that morning, it had certainly not been this. Edward guided Liam toward the private elevator, one hand resting briefly on his old friend's shoulder, and as the doors closed behind them, the lobby erupted into a storm of whispered speculation. Employees clustered together in small groups, trading fragments of information, none of them possessing enough of the story to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The receptionist who had questioned his letter sat frozen at her desk, replaying the exchange in her mind, wondering with growing dread whether she had just made an enormous mistake in front of the one person in the building whose opinion of her mattered most. The 2 junior directors who had laughed at his shoes earlier exchanged a nervous glance, already trying to remember exactly what they had said and how loudly they had said it. Amelia remained rooted near the reception desk, her mind racing backward through everything she had said only minutes earlier, replaying each word with a growing, uncomfortable weight settling in her chest. She had called him ragged. She had called his presence an embarrassment. She had ordered him removed from the very floor where the chairman himself had just welcomed him home, like a brother returning from a long and difficult journey. For the first time and longer than she could remember, Amelia Hale did not know what to do with herself, standing motionless in the middle of her own company's lobby while dozens of employees pretended not to watch her. Upstairs, in a quiet conference room with a view stretching out over the entire city skyline, Edward finally allowed himself to exhale, the years falling briefly from his shoulders as he studied the man across from him. "It has been a long time," he said, his voice thick with something between gratitude and regret. Liam nodded, settling into a chair with the same unhurried calm he carried everywhere, and for a moment neither man spoke, letting the silence hold 2 decades of unspoken history between them. Edward finally broke it, explaining that he had never stopped searching for the right moment to bring Liam back, never stopped believing that the company owed its very existence to a man the world outside had long since forgotten. 20 years earlier, before the glass towers, before the billion-dollar valuations, before Amelia Hale had even finished business school, Liam Foster and Edward Sterling had built something together in a cramped office with flickering fluorescent lights and second-hand furniture. Liam had been the quiet genius behind it all, the one who sketched the very first architecture on a whiteboard late into the night, who designed the artificial intelligence framework that would eventually become the backbone of the entire corporation, who solved problems that other engineers had declared impossible. Edward had handled the business side, the investors, the growth, but he had always known, and often said, that without Liam there would be no company at all, only an idea that withered before it ever had the chance to breathe. Edward remembered those early years with a clarity that surprised even himself, describing nights when the two of them had slept on the office floor rather than go home, surviving on cold coffee and the shared conviction that they were building something the world had not yet imagined. He recalled the first time investors had walked away from their pitch meeting unimpressed, and how Liam, undeterred, had spent the following 3 days rebuilding the entire demonstration from scratch, arriving at the next meeting with something so far beyond what anyone expected that the same investors had practically begged to be included. He spoke of arguments they had, disagreements over direction and strategy, and how even in disagreement, Liam's instincts had almost always proven correct in the end. There had never been another partnership like it, Edward admitted, and there likely never would be again. Then tragedy had arrived quietly, the way it often does, reshaping a life in a matter of days. Liam's wife had fallen seriously ill during the company's most critical early expansion. At a moment when every hour of his attention seemed essential to the business he had poured his entire life into building. He had faced an impossible choice, one that no success, no valuation, no title could ever outweigh. And he had chosen his family without a single moment of hesitation. He stepped away from the company at the height of its early success, walking away from titles, from wealth, from recognition, without a word of protest or regret, spending the following years caring for his wife and later, after her passing, raising their young son largely on his own. Far from boardrooms and headlines, he refused every position offered to him in the years that followed, declined every attempt Edward made to bring him back into the spotlight, and instead built a quiet, private life, far from the glass towers and shareholder meetings that had once defined his days. He took on small consulting projects when money grew tight, taught himself to live simply, and found a strange kind of peace in a life stripped of the noise that had once surrounded him. Few people beyond Edward himself even remembered his name. And Liam had preferred it that way, content to watch from a distance as the company he had helped create grew into something enormous, something that no longer knew the shape of the hands that had built its earliest foundations. Edward had never stopped calling, never stopped sending updates, never stopped hoping that one day circumstances would allow his old friend to return, and when Liam had finally called him 3 weeks earlier to say he was ready, Edward had not asked a single question before offering him anything he wanted. Before the board meeting began, Edward paused at the door of the small conference room and asked Liam, quietly, whether he wanted to say anything about what had happened downstairs, whether he wanted Amelia disciplined or removed from her position entirely, given the way she had spoken to him in front of so many witnesses. Liam considered the question for a long moment, turning his empty coffee cup slowly in his hands, and then shook his head. "People are shaped by the rooms they grow up in," he said finally, "and she has spent years in rooms that rewarded exactly the instincts she showed this morning. Punishing her for that without giving her the chance to see it differently would only prove her right about how the world works." Edward studied his old friend for a moment, the same quiet admiration in his eyes that had been there 20 years earlier, and said nothing more, simply nodding and leading the way toward the boardroom. Word of the chairman's private meeting spread through the company with astonishing speed, and by the time the executive board gathered later that morning, the entire room was already buzzing with anticipation. Every seat at the long conference table was filled, department heads and senior directors leaning forward as Edward stood at the head of the room and made an announcement that silenced every conversation instantly. The company was preparing to launch an artificial intelligence initiative worth several $billion, a project that would reshape the entire direction of the corporation for the next decade. "And the person chosen to lead it," Edward said, his eyes briefly meeting Liam's across the room, was a man many of them had already met that very morning, though few had recognized him for who he truly was. Amelia sat frozen at her place near the head of the table, her composure cracking for the first time in longer than she could remember. Around her, directors exchanged startled glances, murmurs rising and falling as the weight of the announcement settled over the room. Liam rose from his seat without any trace of triumph or vindication, walked calmly to the whiteboard at the front of the room, and began to speak. his voice steady and unhurried. He did not rely on elaborate slides or rehearsed presentations. He simply picked up a marker and began sketching, laying out the architecture of the project with the same clarity and precision that had once built the company from nothing. He identified bottlenecks that senior engineers had struggled with for months, drawing connections between systems that had been treated as separate problems for far too long. He proposed solutions that reframed the entire strategy, speaking in a language that was technical enough to satisfy the engineers in the room, and yet simple enough that even the most business-minded executives could follow every step of his reasoning. One senior engineer, a woman who had spent nearly a decade with the company and had grown skeptical of outside consultants promising quick fixes, raised her hand and challenged one of his proposed solutions, certain she had found a flaw he had overlooked. Liam listened to her objection fully, without interrupting, and then calmly walked through the exact reasoning that addressed her concern, revealing a layer of the problem she had not yet considered. Rather than feeling embarrassed, she found herself nodding slowly, scribbling notes as quickly as she could, already reconsidering months of assumptions in light of a single conversation. Other engineers began leaning forward in their seats, their earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity, occasionally exchanging glances that silently confirmed what they were all beginning to understand. He answered every question thrown his way, with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 20 years thinking deeply about problems the rest of the room was only beginning to understand. He spoke of possibilities the company had never considered, applications that could extend far beyond their current market, entire directions for growth that made even the most experienced board members sit up a little straighter in their chairs. One by one, the skepticism in the room dissolved into something closer to awe. And by the time he set the marker down, capping it with a quiet, deliberate motion, every person present understood exactly why Edward Sterling had called this unassuming man in a worn jacket by a single, weighted title, boss. Amelia excused herself from the room before the meeting fully concluded, walking briskly toward an empty office, where she could finally be alone with the thoughts crowding her mind. She sat down slowly, replaying the morning's events over and over, each memory landing with sharper discomfort than the last. She heard her own voice again, cutting through the lobby, mocking a man's clothing without knowing a single thing about the life behind it. She saw his calm expression, the complete absence of anger, even as she humiliated him in front of dozens of witnesses, and she understood, with a clarity that made her stomach tighten, that she had judged a person's worth by the fabric on his back, rather than the mind and character within him. Shame settled over her first, heavy and unfamiliar, followed by a deeper regret that reached further than simple embarrassment. She thought of every other moment in her career when she had made swift judgments based on appearance, every visitor she had dismissed, every employee she had underestimated because they did not fit the polished image she had built her entire identity around. She remembered a young intern from years earlier, a nervous, poorly dressed young man she had barely acknowledged during his brief time with the company, and wondered now, with a pang of discomfort, how many quiet contributions she might have missed simply because she had never bothered to look past his appearance long enough to notice. She thought, too, of her own beginnings, of the years before her tailored blazers and confident stride, when she had worked 2 jobs to afford her education and had once been turned away from an internship interview because her only interview outfit had been slightly out of fashion. She had promised herself back then that she would never let anyone else feel small the way she had felt that day. And yet somewhere along the path to success, she had built an entirely different set of standards, ones that valued the very surface qualities she once resented being judged by. The realization settled over her like a slow, cold weight, and for the first time in years, Amelia Hale did not know exactly what to do with herself. By the time the afternoon light began to slant through the office windows, Amelia had made a decision. She found Liam alone in the small conference room where Edward had first welcomed him back, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment before finally stepping inside. Her earlier confidence had disappeared entirely, replaced by something quieter and far more vulnerable. "I owe you an apology," she began, her voice steady despite the visible effort it took to keep it that way. "Not the kind people offer when they are caught, but the kind they offer when they finally understand what they have done. She told him she had spent the entire afternoon replaying the morning in her mind, hearing her own words over and over, each one landing heavier than the last. She admitted that she had built her entire career around an assumption she had never once questioned, that appearance and competence walked hand in hand, and that watching him stand at that whiteboard, dismantling problems her own engineers had struggled with for months, had shattered that assumption completely. She did not ask for forgiveness, only for the chance to understand how she might do better. Liam listened without interrupting, his expression patient, his eyes never leaving hers, and when she finished, he studied her for a moment with an expression that held no trace of resentment. There was something almost gentle in the way he considered her words, as though he had expected this conversation might happen eventually, and had already decided long before entering the building how he intended to respond to it. Many in the company had quietly expected Liam to seek some form of retribution, to use his newfound authority to humble the woman who had humiliated him so publicly only hours earlier. But that was never who he was. And he made that clear the moment he spoke. "I am not concerned with what you said to me," he told her, his voice calm and unwavering. "I am concerned that it could happen to anyone else who walks through those doors." It was not a statement of anger, but one of purpose, and Amelia felt the full weight of it settle over her as she listened. Rather than seeking punishment, Liam proposed something far more lasting. He suggested a complete reevaluation of how the company treated the people who passed through its lobby every single day, a cultural shift built on principles that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with respect. He laid out his vision plainly. No one within these walls should ever again be judged by the clothes on their back before their character or their competence had even been considered. Hiring decisions should rest on skill and potential rather than polish and presentation. Leaders throughout the organization needed to understand that true authority was measured by how they treated those with the least power in a room, not those with the most. And every employee, from the newest receptionist to the most senior executive, deserved protection from the kind of public humiliation that had unfolded in the lobby that very morning. He also proposed something more specific, a mentorship initiative that would identify talented individuals from backgrounds the company had traditionally overlooked, offering them pathways into roles they might never have otherwise been considered for. He spoke of his own years working small, thankless jobs after leaving the company, of skilled and capable people he had met along the way who never received a fair chance simply because they lacked the right appearance or the right connections walking through the right doors. Every one of them, he said, deserved the same opportunity he had once been given in a cramped office with flickering lights. An opportunity built on nothing more than the belief that ability mattered more than image. Edward, who had been standing quietly near the doorway throughout the exchange, agreed without a moment's hesitation. And when the proposal was brought before the full executive board later that week, it passed unanimously, met with applause that seemed to carry more meaning than any of them had expected. Several directors who had witnessed the lobby incident firsthand found themselves unusually quiet during the vote, privately reflecting on their own laughter that morning, on the careless words they had exchanged without a second thought. The months that followed brought a quiet but noticeable transformation throughout the company. The reception staff underwent new training, learning to treat every visitor, regardless of appearance, with the same measure of respect and patience. The receptionist who had once questioned Liam's letter so thoroughly became, in time, one of the strongest voices advocating for the new culture, often telling new hires during their orientation about the quiet lesson she had learned that cold morning, though she rarely mentioned her own role in it directly. Amelia, humbled by the experience in ways that reshaped how she carried herself in every meeting afterward, became a different kind of leader, one who listened more than she judged, and who made a point of learning the names and stories of employees she once would have overlooked entirely. She began arriving early some mornings, simply to greet people in the lobby, learning names she had never bothered to learn before, asking questions about lives she had never previously considered worth asking about. Colleagues who had known her for years noticed the change immediately, some skeptical at first that it would last, others quietly grateful for a shift they had hoped for without ever expecting to see. Workers throughout the building began to speak of a shift in the atmosphere, a sense that they were finally seen as more than titles or job descriptions. The mentorship program Liam had proposed welcomed its first group of participants within a few months, young men and women from backgrounds the company had never before considered, several of whom went on to make contributions that surprised even their most optimistic supporters. The artificial intelligence initiative Liam led moved forward with remarkable success, solving problems that had stalled for years and pushing the company's value higher than even the most optimistic projections had predicted. Investors took notice, and the corporation's standing in the industry grew stronger with every passing quarter, its reputation for innovation now matched by a growing reputation for the way it treated the people within its own walls. Through all of it, Liam remained exactly who he had always been. He declined every offer to take the position of chief executive, choosing instead to serve as a strategist and advisor, a quiet guiding presence, rather than a figure seeking recognition or power. He worked from a modest office on one of the lower floors, meeting with engineers and executives alike, with the same unhurried patience he had shown that very first morning in the lobby. He never mentioned the humiliation he had endured, never brought it up in meetings or used it as leverage, content instead to let his actions speak for a philosophy he had carried with him for 20 years. Long before anyone in that building had known his name, his son, now nearly grown, would sometimes stop by the office after school, sitting quietly in the corner while his father worked, and it was not lost on the younger employees who saw them together how naturally Liam still carried himself as a father first, an engineer second, and a titan of industry a distant third, if he considered himself one at all. Edward often remarked, with a fondness that had not dimmed in 20 years, that the company had gained back not just its finest mind, but its conscience as well, and that the two had always been harder to separate than most people realized. Amelia, for her part, began speaking occasionally at industry gatherings about the lesson she had learned that morning in the lobby, never naming herself as the villain of the story outright, but never softening the truth of what she had done either. She spoke of the danger of building a career around appearances, of the blind spots that formed when success made a person too comfortable with their own judgment, and more than a few young executives in those audiences would later admit that her words had changed the way they walked into a room for the very first time. On the day he finally decided to step back from his advisory role, preparing to return to the quieter life he had always preferred, Amelia found him gathering a few belongings from his small office. She lingered in the doorway, studying the same worn jacket he had worn that first morning, the fabric no less faded, the stitching no less careful. "Why do you still wear that suit?" she asked him, her voice gentler now than it had ever been during that first encounter months earlier. Liam looked down at the jacket for a moment, then back at her, a small, knowing smile crossing his face. "Because it reminds me," he said quietly, "that a person's worth was never something that could be measured by what they chose to wear." He walked out of the building that afternoon in the very same suit he had arrived in all those months before, the fabric still thin at the elbows, the shoes still modest and carefully polished. But something in the lobby had changed entirely since that first cold morning. As he crossed the marble floor toward the revolving doors, employees throughout the atrium rose quietly from their desks, one after another, bowing their heads in a gesture of respect that needed no explanation. Edward walked with him as far as the entrance, the two old friends pausing near the revolving doors for a final quiet exchange. "You could stay," Edward offered once more. Though he already knew the answer, Liam only smiled, the same tired, gentle smile he had worn that very first morning, and told him that some men were built to lead from the front of a room, while others were only ever meant to build the foundation and then step quietly aside once it could stand on its own. Edward laughed softly at that, shaking his head, and told him that, after 20 years, he had stopped trying to argue with him about anything that mattered. The receptionist, who had once questioned his very right to stand in that lobby, watched him go with an expression of quiet gratitude, understanding now what she had failed to see months earlier. A young security guard, the same one who had sensed months ago that something about the stranger did not fit the assumptions swirling around him, gave a small, respectful nod as Liam passed, a gesture Liam returned without breaking his unhurried stride. The doors closed behind him, and the city outside carried on exactly as it always had. indifferent to the quiet man walking into it. Though everyone who had watched him leave understood that nothing about that lobby, or the people within it, would ever be quite the same again. Years later, employees who had never even met Liam Foster would still hear his name mentioned in quiet conversations throughout the building, usually whenever a new hire arrived dressed a little too plainly, or a visitor was met at the front desk with an unkind glance that lingered a moment too long. Someone would inevitably mention the story of the man in the $20 suit, and the lesson would pass quietly from one employee to the next, the way important lessons often do, not through official policy alone, but through memory and quiet repetition. A suit may cause others to judge a person within the span of a few seconds, but it is character, intelligence, and the quiet, lasting contributions a person makes to the world that ultimately determine their true worth across the whole of a lifetime. Liam Foster had known this long before anyone in that gleaming lobby had ever spoken his name. And by the time he walked away from the company for the final time, everyone who had once mocked him understood it too, carrying the lesson with them long after the doors had closed behind his quiet, unassuming figure. Somewhere across the city, in a modest apartment far from glass towers and executive floors, a man in a worn but carefully pressed jacket settled into a familiar chair, content in the knowledge that he had never once needed a title to know exactly who he was.